So we're going to have a fun chat because it's lunch, and I wanted to kick off by asking a question that we had discussed earlier, which is about our stunt that we're hoping to initiate some of you into. So with IBM Watson, I think most of us have probably heard of the Jeopardy challenge. Any nods? Where IBM supercomputer was able to beat some of the smartest humans at Jeopardy. Can you talk a little bit about that win and what that meant?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Dr. Saxon, and everyone here at the Center for Body Computing, inviting me. This is my first time here. This is a great audience. So to answer the question about, what was that Jeopardy like, I tell folks that 2011 Jeopardy win was essentially IBM's Watson proof of concept to the world. And what I mean by that is IBM had this background with Watson, and in 1997, if you think about Big Blue and the chess kind of win it had back then, that's kind of when the seeds were planted, if you will, at least publicly. But we looked at essentially an integrated set of technologies, APIs, services, applications, and said, can we put these and integrate them in such a way and focus it on a use case to do X? And in 2011, that use case was Jeopardy, general trivia. And it won, and so once that proof of concept was not only demonstrated to the world, but also to IBM, the next step is, what else can we do? What other use cases can we adapt this model for? So some of the current technologies, APIs, applications, again, services, and so forth, are analogs or descendants of those capabilities that won Jeopardy, but now we're deploying them in other industries, and what's pertinent here, for example, is healthcare, but then finance, fashion, for those of you who follow the general media and how Watson designed a dress, cooking, automotive, retail, all those different areas, and then tying all the data sets together on the back end.
So my big question to you today was, what could we do in healthcare that would be equivalent to that Jeopardy case? And you immediately had an idea, and we thought we'd throw it out to the audience and see whether anyone wants to participate.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I loved your use of the term stunt. And I think ultimately, what we need to do with Watson, and I have two hats, and we can get into my background later, but I look at everything that we're doing with IBM as a technologist as well as a clinical perspective. And from a clinical perspective, all this technology is great, but how are we going to validate it? At the very least, demonstrate non-inferiority to existing models of care delivery, diagnosis, treatment, and so forth. But then how are we, hopefully, going to demonstrate superiority? So the stunt, to get back to that, is, how cool would it be, and we're a ways off, and we'll get there though, to demonstrate that if we have 10 docs, let's say 10 doctors, each has a panel of, let's say, 5 to 10 patients, and they have, let's give them more than the average amount of time that doctors spend currently with patients. Let's give them 20 minutes with a patient, not the average 8 to 12.
It's really sad that that's more than the average.
It's an average, right? So some might take longer, some might take less, depending upon how much time they're staring at the computer while they're with the patient. But let's just say 8 to 12 minutes, but let's give them 20, to take a history. Then let's give them an additional 30 minutes to do some pre-reading and post-reading if they want to do additional data abstraction and documentation, to derive an H&P, history and physical, to come up with an assessment and plan, and then let's benchmark that or compare that to what Watson is able to do in the same amount of time, in the same way. Ingest not only structured and unstructured data sources from the electronic health record and so forth, but also have Watson interview the patient. And let's see what happens between the two. How close do they get to one another? What are the differences and why? And so I think that would be an interesting stunt to, for me, selfishly demonstrate that can even a machine even do it, but then to demonstrate to those docs that argue that machines can never do some of the impersonal things that they do, data abstraction, data entry. Can we have a machine do that, but still have the physician at the point of care hold the hand and console the patient or talk to the patient and his or her family and make it relatable?
So if any brave docs are willing to go up against IBM Watson, this guy, he's taking
Oh yeah, call
names.
me, email me, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great use case. And I really want to push the envelope at IBM Watson to think about things this way, think about these crazy types of ideas and figure out ways to do it. So we're not just doing commercials, we're actually able to go forward with some real solutions.
So I'm really struggling to imagine what it would be like to have an IBM Watson interview me as a patient. I have so many questions about the implications of all of this, but what would that even doctor sound like? Would it have an American accent? Would it be a male or female?
That is a great question. So if we think about the commercials you've seen, the interaction that Watson has right now, I think could use some refinement, particularly for some empathy, UI, UX stuff we saw last night from some of the students and the folks who are working on those. So I think ultimately, to answer your question, what it would feel like, it would be what resonates most with the patient and his or her family. So if it's a particular accent, particular cultural background, that's exactly what
So
they
I get a British woman.
If you'd like, if that's what your profile indicates is what's there for you and what's recommended for you, that's what you'll respond to. And then the interesting thing is, how does your comfort level with the interviewer as a physician change as you get older or as you're in a different situation? When you have a surgical problem, you may want to see a specific type of provider with a specific type of background, whereas if you're there for just a routine preventative care visit or something, you might be open to some other different personas that would be able to. So I think it would vary, and it'd be ultimately, through data science, what would resonate the best to that patient at that moment in time.
So if all of this becomes, real in this hypothetical future, I mean, as a journalist, we love the storyline of robots taking your jobs. We can't get enough of it. And I'll often hear back, it's never about robots taking your jobs, it's about augmenting and assisting you in your job. But it does sound like there would be some change in the role that a doctor plays. And can you speak a little bit about what would change?
Absolutely. I think when I envision it at a high level, the first thing I would say is, and the tagline I kind of been using is, let Watson do all the impersonal things, such as data abstraction, data entry, comparing how an individual's data points, structured and unstructured, compare to the medical literature, to other patients like him or her, athletes, et cetera. And then let the physicians do the personal stuff. Go back to actually talking to the patient, looking at the patient in the eye rather than looking at the computer screen, and doing those types of things. So with that kind of as the backdrop, I would say that, yes, there should be some pieces that a machine should take over. On the back end, why can't the machine abstract the data and put together a clinical profile, again, from structured and unstructured data sources, and provide to the caregiver, hey, here's what I'm seeing for this patient based upon coded data, based upon EHR data, based upon CT scan images and so forth. What do you think? And then let the provider be able to say, this is what we think is most relevant for you. So I think that there are going to be some. Now, of course, I think it all comes back to validating that data abstraction is not inferior to the data abstraction that a caregiver currently does. Yep. That the data entry is not inferior. And then I would hypothesize that in many instances, it may actually be superior, but we still have to do that validation before that, okay, I kind of call it validation, automation, and then iteration are kind of the three phases.
So one thing I've been curious about is, when we talk about these sort of technologies that can assist doctors and clinicians, what specialties do you see being most open to this first? I've heard, radiology is one of them, primary care is another one. What are you actually seeing in terms of interest from various specialties?
So in my day-to-day job, I'm very, very lucky. I tell folks that in my day job, I explain and convey clinical concepts to tech folks, and I explain technical concepts to clinical folks and try to help.
How does that go?
It goes better than not, but it's kind of selection bias, because the folks that call me, the clinical folks that call me, are the ones that are very interested in the technology. They want to do this type of, they're already ready and willing. They've kind of crossed that initial barrier. The ones that aren't calling me, obviously, have not crossed that barrier yet, potentially. But the certain specialties that I talk to a lot of folks who are trying to, particularly critical care docs or critical care intensivists. They're the ones that they have so much data. If you just imagine being in an ICU and all the beeping that goes on in an ICU, and I've worked in one, so I still have some PTSD from it. But intensivists, so you think about your data-heavy specialties, intensivists, internal medicine docs, radiologists, oncologists. You see a lot there because they have to not only understand the clinical profile, they have to understand the tumor profile, and they also have to understand and keep up with what's the most appropriate chemotherapeutic regimen, for example, for this patient post-operatively. Should they even have an operation? So all these different fields. So I see a lot of, again, intensivists, radiologists, you do see a lot, oncologists, and then folks who are where clinical trial matching does fall into it. Again, if you look at the kind of abysmal enrollment for clinical trials, about 3 to 5% on average is, I think, the last number of patients who would be eligible for a clinical trial actually get enrolled into a clinical trial. Then that's why it's not an accident that some of our initial Watson Health applications are Watson for oncology, Watson for clinical trial matching, Watson for care management. So, because even aside from the physicians directly, you have care managers who are juggling a lot of data for chronic patients that they're managing. So that's a long answer to your question. The short answer is likely intensivists, oncologists, researchers, as well as you see some in imaging, especially when you think about our acquisitions like Merge Healthcare, we do see a lot of imaging stuff too.
And do they tend to come to you, or is it a combination of things, but is it because doctors are feeling burnout, which we've definitely talked about today, and one of the big reasons is that just like so much documentation and the feeling of being a data entry clerk? Is it because of, this is a desperate situation, we need your help, or is it more, I want to see what's out there, what's sort of cool in technology that we could bring in to make our practice more progressive or forward-leaning?
Absolutely. So the big one I see, I hear this all the time, especially just with the U.S. Open and tennis having passed. I say this commercial. So the commercials actually do have some penetrance, particularly what we see in the commercials. Obviously, you see the Watson orb and the interaction. What folks really, I think, I missed until I really sat down and thought about it is who are the partners in those commercials, particularly for healthcare. You see Cleveland Clinic is a partner. So we can't do this without any of the partnerships. So they see these commercials and they call and say, hey, listen, I've got all this data. And typically phase one is there's a lot of structured data that they just want to go faster, deeper, and broader with on their structured data analytics. But then they also say, hey, I've got all this other data that I can't touch. So they see the commercials, they come to us because they want to understand how can they go derive insights from the data they've already got. And some of it is because it's very interesting too. Some of these physicians who call, or even clinical leaders who call, have either worked at IBM or have some kind of connection to the tech industry, and they're very on top of machine learning, and they just kind of like a crapshoot they call. Then the other is we're a business, so we also try to reach out to folks and try to get them to implement Watson for oncology or trial matching, or let's co-develop with long-term engagements and partnerships, get all that, integrate our data, integrate our technologies, optimize our delivery mechanisms, and let's go validate this.
So how have you been able to sort of fill in a lot of these huge gaps that we've definitely talked about today with just, data that we're not able to get out of the clinical system? And I think increasingly we are able to get it from the consumer-generated side, but in that case, you need very clear transparency around privacy and consent and everything else. Yeah. Can you talk about the process of aggregating that?
Yes, tedious. It's a bear but it's a reason why a lot of folks at IBM have jobs, is because that is the first and foremost thing we're trying to do. Is it's been relatively easy to get the structured data. So when you talk about a health system, we partner again with the health systems, and we have research projects to demonstrate that just predictive structured analytics, we can get that. The unstructured data, medical records and EHR, and I really love what Medible's founder and CEO, I apologize for forgetting your name, but I really love what you said. Michelle. I love what she said in about 20 years, how EHR data may be irrelevant because patient-generated data, we can extrapolate and derive a lot of insights from that. There may be some other pieces of the EHR we'll still need, for example, CT scan images and those types of things, and some of the, maybe path reports aren't necessarily generated at home by a patient's wearable or something like that, but we still need some of that data. But we partner with these health systems because ultimately it's their data. You could partner with EHR vendors. They've pledged interoperability since 2011, right before HIMSS every year. They pledge interoperability, and then it kind of disappears out of the headlines. But we actually work with the health systems directly to get their data, get that data into our systems, and there's a lot of issues here too with getting that data because we're a cloud company now. We're trying to get all this data in a HIPAA-compliant cloud. Health systems aren't comfortable with that. They don't want their data in a cloud. Mm-hmm. So working with them to do on-premises proof of concepts to demonstrate that we can secure the data, derive insights from it, integrate it with other data sets, structured and unstructured. That's the biggest challenge, is convincing them first and foremost to let us have access to the data. Once we have access to it, integrating it and normalizing it because there's no standard is also challenging. And then once you do that, the Watson APIs and services is the easy part. You just plug that data into an API. I'm speaking like I'm the engineer that's doing all this work, right? But, but relatively speaking, once you actually aggregate, normalize, then the technology is relatively the easy part to run the APIs and services to derive the insights.
How long do you think it's going to be before, anyone walks into the OR or walks into an appointment with their doctor and Watson is somehow part of that process?
So it's already happening. That's one of the cool things about it is, our vision and mission right now as IBM is to power the solutions to deliver personalized and clinically and contextually relevant insights to patients, consumers, and caregivers. The way it's happening is I'll refer back to the Watson for Oncology product, for example, and then let me just walk through an example of what it was like for me. I wanted to go into surgical oncology. So for those who don't know my background, I've been with IBM about a year leading the Watson Health ecosystem. Prior to that, I did health IT consulting, and prior to that, I was a general surgeon in San Antonio, Texas. And I also have a computer science degree. And I wanted to go into surgical oncology. Loved it. So as a med student, and I won't say what state I'm from because it's been just too recent considering some sporting events that have happened here, but I would see this patient post-mastectomy, for example, and I had this patient's clinical profile. I had their whole history in front of me, social, family, et cetera. I had the tumor pathology, the TNM score, as well as the estrogen receptor status, progesterone receptor status, some of these clinical parameters for this breast cancer that the patient had. And I would go to a big desktop and in this multidisciplinary oncology room, and I would go to cancer.gov, calculate Gale score, all this good stuff to figure out what is the risk of recurrence, what it should be the chemotherapeutic regimen, and so forth. Watson does all that now.
Were you thinking at the time, like, I should not be doing this, a machine should be doing it?
No, I wish I was. In hindsight, maybe subconsciously I was, but at the moment, I'm just thinking of, like every other doctor, is taking care of the patient in front of me. I want to make sure I give the right information to this patient. And actually, there was one step before that, unfortunately, just because of medical hierarchy in this country, is I was like, I need to make sure I have all my data points so the attending doesn't yell at me. That was the first thing. So I got all the data points, put all that together, and then now I sat down, because I work very closely with the Watson for Oncology team, and I literally did all of that within seconds. Watson had ingested and read a patient's entire clinical profile. It already knew, based upon having read PubMed, Medline, what was the latest evidence for a particular tumor type. And I even threw in a curveball for Watson. I said, this patient I operated, we did the mastectomy, we did the sentinel lymph node biopsy, and so some clinicians in there, I apologize for the non-clinicians, I'll put this in layman's terms maybe later, but I said, yeah, we did a sentinel lymph node biopsy, which means that the first lymph node outside of the breast had cancer in it. And I said that sentinel lymph node was positive for cancer. And if that's the case, you have to do an axillary node dissection. You have to take out as many lymph nodes as possible so that you're essentially taking out all the cancer. I told Watson that, yeah, sentinel lymph node was positive, but I did not do an axillary node dissection. So Watson said, I recommend an operation. Here's the chemotherapeutic options you can consider based on this clinical patient profile. By the way, you should probably have done an axillary node dissection. So it knew the literature enough to where even I couldn't even throw it off. And now obviously there will be gaps and so forth, and that's one example. But there actually are physicians at Memorial Sloan Kettering who are using that. This was Watson for Oncology, built by IBM, trained by Memorial Sloan Kettering, and physicians are actually using it. So I gave you a long anecdotal answer. I hope that answers your question.
Quick question people are asking me back here.
Yeah.
Since Watson did Jeopardy, how about Watson for patients? Why can't, if my doctor can't diagnose me or whatever, where are you guys on regulation and reaching directly to the patient so they can use that tool for their
Would it be so that a patient could diagnose themselves?
Well, they can't get diagnosed. A lot of patients come and they've been to 4 or 5 doctors by the time they see us or USC, and why wouldn't that be a powerful service to be able to offer a patient?
That would be an absolute powerful service. And there's the conversations, and I get this question all the time, thanks, Dr. Saxon, is if you look at IBM's background in history, it's primarily enterprise. It's really working with the health systems and the businesses. That's not true. You look at some of IBM laptops and so forth, maybe there's some consumer, but IBM's never really sold to consumers directly. The example I like to use here, too, is grocery stores, for example. You go to a grocery store, you don't know that the point-of-sale device there is an IBM machine. I didn't know until my son pointed it out when we were at the grocery store one day. But that's how IBM tends to operate. It's kind of in the background, powering the solution. So we actually partner with companies, startups and larger companies, who are building those consumer-facing applications that do bring all that data into a data lake, and then we work with them to integrate the data, normalize the data, derive insights from that data, and then if they want us to, we can even help with UI, UX, and how they deliver it to the patients and to the consumers. But in that way, it accomplishes two things. We're not necessarily a consumer company per se, so it doesn't necessarily play to our strength. But number two, it actually prevents us having to fight some of these FDA battles. Like the most recent FDA battle we've had to fight was just because of our Merge Healthcare acquisition, and because they're an imaging company, they're a Class 2 device, and so now we are. But it eliminates that kind of battle, because the companies that are using our technologies are the ones fighting the FDA fight. They're just telling in their submissions or applications that we're using Watson technologies for this solution that they are selling to consumers. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that you don't have the culture for it, and that it doesn't feel safe, and that it doesn't feel like you need to do it.
A lot of risk and a lot of liability. That's why we won't see a Dr. Watson. You'll see like a Dr. so-and-so.
But on this problem, like we'll show some of our virtual human stuff this afternoon, but on this problem of there never being enough experts and having to go through the medical system, you're always going to be limited in the number of patients you can reach, because a lot of countries don't have medical systems and things. So it just seems so interesting to have such a powerful tool.
I agree with you, and I think that's why I personally haven't closed that door, and I try to push a lot of people at IBM Watson. Can we, nudge them, try to figure it out, and we might. Ultimately, this is where this is a great opportunity for all the startups. If they're able to partner with us, a lot of startups, they have great vision. Some of them have really, really great funding. They have the ability to utilize our technologies. One thing they might be missing is the clinical data. They might be missing the data because they don't yet have a partnership with a USC, Keck, or some of the other health systems in the country. So when we find those, I call it cherry picking. When we find those, and I say cherry picking, but it's really based on three factors, those companies that have tremendous clinical and scientific impact, either already or potential. They have tremendous technical innovation and innovative potential. And three, which is still a business, they have commercial viability. They have demonstrated the ability to make money, or they have a strong customer pipeline saying, if we bring all this data together, we will improve outcomes, we will bend the quality curve. I don't believe in bending the cost curve, or the value curve rather, we should bend. Quality over cost. We have a technology, maybe they're post-technology, or they have great engineers and they've demonstrated, and then they have a commercially viable. We cherry pick them to be able to go to market with them. So instead of us building the consumer-facing, we power their consumer-facing. And then ultimately it becomes, we have a term we use at IBM called co-opetition. Even if we are building it, we can still partner with other folks, and I call it survival of the fittest. Whoever develops it first and has the most impact clinically, technically, and commercially, perhaps we just acquire them and make them part of the IBM family instead of investing all that time and energy on our own. You didn't hear me say that. I hope this is not being recorded, but I know it is.
Reminds me a little bit of
Let's thank Dr. Chaitanya Dahagam, Global Partner, Innovation Executive, IBM Watson, and our favorite, Christina Farr.